In 1998, an isolated boarding school in the French Alps suddenly closed its doors. The official explanation was simple: structural problems. The building was considered unsafe. Students were sent home, staff disappeared, and Saint-Antoine Boarding School quietly vanished from public view. But according to former students, that wasn't why it closed. In the months before Saint-Antoine was abandoned, several children reportedly disappeared from the school. Each time the explanation was identical. Their parents had come to collect them. There was only one problem. No one ever saw the parents arrive. No cars entered the property. No luggage was packed. There were no goodbyes. One day, a student would be sitting in class, and the next morning, their bed would be empty. Their name would stop being mentioned. And everyone was expected to behave as though they had never been there. One former student, whom we'll call Lucas, claimed there was another rule at Saint-Antoine. A rule nobody explained to new arrivals. There was a section beneath the school that students were never supposed to enter. Those who did sometimes came back different, quieter, confused, unable or unwilling to describe what had happened to them. Others apparently never came back at all. For weeks, Lucas tried to convince himself that the rumors were exaggerated, until one night. A telephone in an empty hallway began ringing shortly after midnight. Lucas answered it. No one spoke. He heard only breathing. And soon afterward, he discovered a door that had always been locked, standing slightly open. Behind it was a staircase leading underground. What Lucas claimed to have found beneath Saint-Antoine was never officially documented. Student records, lists of names, photographs taken decades apart, in which some of the same children's faces seemed to appear again and again, and an old newspaper clipping describing a fire at Saint-Antoine in 1923, a fire in which several children had reportedly died. The following morning, another student was gone. Once again, the director calmly announced that his parents had picked him up. But this time, Lucas knew that wasn't true, because the boy's name was among the documents he had found the night before. A few weeks later, Lucas himself was suddenly removed from Saint-Antoine. Shortly afterward, the entire school was closed. Today, complete student records have never been publicly confirmed. Some archives reportedly contain references to Saint-Antoine. Others contain nothing at all, almost as if the school had never fully existed. And that leaves one question at the center of this case. If those missing children really went home, why did some of them appear in photographs taken years before they were even born? According to the account that forms the basis of this case, Lucas arrived at Saint-Antoine Boarding School in the fall of 1998. He was 13 years old. His family had been struggling financially for several years. With multiple children at home and both parents working long hours, they had begun looking for an affordable school where Lucas could live during the week. Saint-Antoine seemed almost too convenient. The tuition was unusually low, accommodation and meals were included, and a family acquaintance described the school as strict but respectable. There was, however, one unusual detail. Lucas's parents could find almost nothing about it. No brochure, no photographs, no recognizable listing in the usual school directories. Most communication was handled by telephone and mail. But with few alternatives available, his parents eventually accepted the placement. Lucas later remembered the drive into the mountains more clearly than almost anything else from that first day. The final town disappeared behind them sometime in the afternoon. After that, the road narrowed. Houses became increasingly rare. Dense pine forests surrounded the car, occasionally opening to reveal steep grey mountains partially hidden by low clouds. The higher they climbed, the colder it became. A thin fog settled between the trees. Even the radio reception slowly disappeared. Eventually, Lucas's father switched it off. For the final 20 minutes, they drove almost entirely in silence. Then Saint-Antoine appeared, A large stone building stood alone against the mountainside, 4 stories high. Dark slate roof, tall, narrow windows, a small chapel connected to one side. There were no neighboring buildings, no shops, no homes, nothing except forest and mountains. Lucas remembered thinking that it looked less like a school and more like a place designed to keep people from leaving. Inside, the first thing he noticed was the smell. Dust, damp stone, old wood. And underneath it, something faintly sour that he couldn't identify. The director met them in the entrance hall. His name was Mr. Delmas. He was a thin man in his late 50s, always dressed in a dark suit regardless of the weather. He spoke politely to Lucas's parents, explained meal schedules, study periods, and disciplinary rules. But there was very little warmth in his voice. Before Lucas's parents left, Delmas placed one hand on the boy's shoulder. "Saint-Antoine is different from other schools," he said. "Here you learn to be strong." Lucas didn't understand why, but several students standing nearby immediately looked toward the floor. That reaction stayed with him. Over the next few hours, he began noticing other things. The school wasn't empty. There were dozens of children, yet the building was remarkably quiet. In the dining hall that evening, nearly every seat was occupied, but Lucas heard almost no conversation, only forks touching plates, chairs moving against the floor, occasional whispers. Whenever a teacher entered, even those whispers stopped. Lucas initially assumed the school was simply strict. Then he tried speaking to the boy beside him. "How long have you been here?" The boy continued eating. 2 years. "You like it?" The boy stopped chewing. For several seconds, he stared at his plate, then quietly said, "You shouldn't ask people that." Lucas laughed, assuming it was a joke. The boy didn't. Later that night, Lucas was shown to a dormitory containing 8 beds. 7 were occupied. 1 stood empty near the far wall. The mattress was bare, no sheets, no pillow, no belongings. As Lucas unpacked, he noticed scratches carved into the wooden frame. Letters, a name, Mathieu. He pointed toward it. Who was Mathieu? The room became silent. One boy immediately turned away. Another pretended not to hear. Finally, someone near the window whispered, "He went home." Lucas looked at the empty bed. "When?" No answer. Then another student quietly added, "Don't ask about Mathieu." The lights went out at 10. For nearly 2 hours, Lucas lay awake listening to wind press against the old windows. Then, sometime shortly after midnight, he heard footsteps above them. Slow, measured, crossing the ceiling from one side of the room to the other. Lucas looked around. Several other boys were awake. None of them seemed surprised. "Who's upstairs?" Lucas whispered. The boy in the next bed turned toward him. His face was barely visible in the darkness. "Nobody." Lucas listened as the footsteps continued. "But someone's walking." The boy pulled his blanket higher, then whispered something Lucas would remember years later. "Just pretend you don't hear them." The following morning, Lucas almost convinced himself the footsteps had been part of a dream. In daylight, Saint-Antoine looked less threatening. Students moved between classrooms. Teachers carried books through the corridors. Breakfast was served at exactly 7. Everything followed a routine so precise that it became easy to ignore what happened after dark. But Lucas couldn't forget the reaction he'd received when he mentioned Mathieu. Over the next several days, he began asking questions. Carefully. Most students refused to answer. Some simply changed the subject. Others looked around first, as if checking whether a teacher was close enough to hear. Eventually, Lucas learned that Mathieu had disappeared approximately 3 weeks before his arrival. The official explanation was simple. His parents had collected him. But nobody remembered seeing them. There had been no suitcase in the hallway, no goodbye, no car outside. Mathieu had eaten dinner with everyone else one evening, and by breakfast, his bed was empty. Lucas tried to dismiss it. Perhaps Mathieu had left early in the morning. Perhaps his parents had arrived while everyone was asleep. There were reasonable explanations. Then he met Remy. Remy was 14 and had been at Saint-Antoine for almost 3 years. Unlike most students, he occasionally answered Lucas's questions, but never where teachers could hear them. One evening during dinner, Lucas quietly asked, "What happened to Mathieu?" Remy stopped eating. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he whispered, "He asked too many questions." Lucas frowned. "About what?" Remy glanced toward the teacher's table. "The basement." Lucas waited. "What basement?" Remy's expression changed. "Forget I said anything." But Lucas didn't. Later that night, when they were alone near the laundry room, Remy finally explained. Beneath Saint-Antoine was an older section of the building. Students weren't allowed there. According to Remy, there was a room somewhere underground that students called the special room. It wasn't an official name. No teacher ever used it, but everyone knew what it meant. Students who repeatedly broke rules or asked questions they weren't supposed to ask were sometimes taken downstairs. "What happens to them?" Lucas whispered. Remy shook his head. "I don't know." "You've never seen anyone come back?" "I didn't say that." Remy lowered his voice further. "They come back. Usually." That final word made Lucas uncomfortable. Remy described children returning to the dormitories hours later. Some barely spoke. Others seemed confused about where they'd been. One student reportedly returned without remembering the argument that had caused him to be taken downstairs in the first place, and several refused to discuss the room at all. Then Remy told him about 5 boys. Months earlier, they had decided to investigate the basement themselves. They waited until after lights out and disappeared through one of the restricted corridors. 3 returned. 2 didn't. The next morning, Director Delmas announced that the missing boys had been collected by their parents. No explanation, no farewell, no luggage. Exactly like Mathieu. "What happened to the 3 who came back?" Lucas asked. Remy stared at him. "They stopped talking about it." "Why?" Remy hesitated. "One of them doesn't talk at all anymore." Lucas felt a chill despite the warm laundry room. "And the others? One left? And the third?" Remy didn't answer immediately. Then he looked toward the doorway. "He's still here." "Who?" Remy's eyes shifted past Lucas. Lucas turned. A boy was standing at the far end of the corridor. Thin, pale, perhaps 15. Lucas had seen him before but never heard him speak. The boy wasn't looking at Remy. He was staring directly at Lucas. Then, very slowly, he raised one finger to his lips. "Don't speak." A teacher appeared around the corner seconds later. The boy immediately walked away. Remy left without another word. That night, Lucas lay awake thinking about the basement. Shortly after midnight, the footsteps returned above the dormitory. But this time something was different. They crossed the ceiling, stopped, then resumed, inside the hallway outside Lucas's room, slowly approaching the door. One step, another, then another. Lucas held his breath. The footsteps stopped directly outside. No one entered. No one knocked. After almost a minute, they began moving again, away from the dormitory. Lucas quietly climbed out of bed and opened the door. The corridor was empty, but at the far end, a door he had never seen open before was slowly closing. And just before it shut, Lucas saw the pale boy standing on the other side, waiting for him. Lucas remained in the doorway. The pale boy had disappeared. For several seconds he considered following him. Then the door at the far end of the corridor clicked shut. The sound was enough to change his mind. He returned to bed, but he didn't sleep. Over the following nights, Lucas began paying closer attention to Saint-Antoine after lights out. The footsteps always started shortly after midnight, sometimes above the dormitories, sometimes in distant corridors. They followed a strange pattern, slow, measured, almost deliberate, and Lucas noticed something else. Whenever he sat up in bed, they stopped. When he lay down again, they eventually continued. It began to feel less like someone walking through the school and more like someone checking whether the students were asleep. During the day, the atmosphere changed as well. Certain corridors were suddenly empty. Doors that had previously been open remained locked. Students lowered their voices whenever teachers approached. Even Remy stopped speaking to Lucas. Once, Lucas tried asking him about the pale boy. Remy simply shook his head. "Not here." "Then where?" Remy looked at him. "Nowhere." That was the last conversation they had for several days. Then one night, Lucas woke to a telephone ringing. He checked the clock beside his bed. 12:43 a.m. The sound came from the hallway. An old wall-mounted telephone hung near the stairwell, although Lucas had never seen anyone use it. It rang again. None of the other boys moved. Lucas sat up. Another ring. "Are you guys hearing this?" No answer. Several students were awake. He could tell by their breathing. But everyone remained perfectly still. The telephone kept ringing. Finally, Lucas left the dormitory. The corridor was empty. Only every second ceiling light remained on during the night, leaving long sections of hallway in darkness. The phone rang again. Lucas approached it. He lifted the receiver. "Hello?" Nothing. No static, no distant voice, only silence. Then, breathing. Slow at first, then irregular, as though whoever was on the other end had been running. "Who is this?" The breathing stopped. Lucas waited. A faint sound appeared behind the silence. At first he couldn't identify it. Then he realized it was children, several of them, whispering. The voices were too faint to understand, except for one word. His name. Lucas. He immediately pulled the receiver away from his ear. Then another voice emerged through the line, closer, a boy. "Don't let them." The connection died. Lucas stood frozen. He slowly returned the receiver to its cradle, and somewhere below him, a door opened. Not upstairs. Not in the dormitory corridor. Below. Lucas looked toward the staircase. At the bottom was a hallway he knew well. But tonight, one of the doors at its far end was slightly open. He had never seen it open before. A thin line of yellow light crossed the floor. Lucas remembered Remy's warning. The basement. He should have returned to bed. Instead, he went downstairs. The temperature dropped as he approached the door. A strange smell appeared in the air. Damp stone, old smoke. Something faintly burned. Lucas pushed the door open. Behind it was a narrow staircase descending beneath the building. One weak bulb illuminated the first few steps. Beyond that, darkness. Lucas descended. The air grew colder with every step. At the bottom, he found a narrow stone corridor. Moisture covered the walls. Old pipes ran across the ceiling. Several doors stood along one side. Most were locked. Then Lucas heard something behind him. Ring. He stopped. The telephone upstairs. Ring. Again. Lucas stared back toward the staircase. Then another telephone rang. But this one wasn't upstairs. The sound came from deeper inside the basement. Lucas followed it. At the end of the corridor stood one final door. The ringing came from behind it. He reached for the handle. Before he touched it, the ringing stopped. Silence returned. Then, from the other side of the door, a child whispered, "Lucas." He recognized the voice. It belonged to Mathieu. Lucas stopped breathing. The voice had been faint, muffled by the heavy door, but he was certain of what he had heard. Mathieu. He had never actually met the missing boy. But during his first week at Saint-Antoine, Lucas had found an old cassette recording in the dormitory. Several students could be heard joking in the background. One of them had called Mathieu by name. Lucas remembered his voice. And now, that same voice seemed to be coming from behind the basement door. "Mathieu?" No answer. Lucas placed his hand on the handle. The metal was freezing cold. He turned it. Unlocked. The door opened inward. A small room appeared beyond it. No child was waiting inside. No telephone either. Only a wooden table beneath a weak ceiling light. Shelves covered two walls. Boxes had been stacked in one corner. And across the table, dozens of documents had been spread out as though someone had been examining them only moments earlier. Lucas stepped inside. The smell of smoke was stronger here. Not fresh smoke. Something older, embedded in the walls. He looked behind him. The corridor was empty. Then he approached the table. The first things he noticed were photographs. Class photographs. Dozens of them. Children standing in rows outside Saint-Antoine. Some were black and white. Others had faded colors. Dates were written on the backs. 1931, 1947, 1962, 1975, 1986. Lucas began moving through them. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he stopped. One face looked familiar. A boy in the second row of a photograph dated 1962. Thin face, dark hair, distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. Lucas had seen him at breakfast that morning. He checked another photograph. 1975. The same boy appeared again. Same age, same face. Lucas felt his stomach tighten. He pulled another photograph from the pile. 1986. There he was. Again. Then Lucas found Remy. Not someone who resembled him. Remy. Standing near the edge of a photograph dated 1947. He looked exactly 14 years old. Exactly as he did now. Lucas dropped the photograph. Beside the pictures were handwritten lists, names, dates, room numbers. Some belonged to students currently attending Saint-Antoine. Others belonged to children Lucas had heard about. Mathieu. The two boys who had disappeared after entering the basement. And then Theo. Beside Theo's name was a date. Tomorrow's date. Lucas stared at it. A cold sensation moved through his chest. Then he saw another name farther down the page. Lucas. There was no date beside it. Not yet. He stepped backward. His hand struck a pile of papers. Something fell to the floor. An old newspaper clipping. Lucas picked it up. The paper was yellow and fragile. The headline described a fire at Saint-Antoine in 1923. Several children had died. The exact number was unclear. The cause had never been conclusively established. But one sentence caught Lucas's attention. The fire had started in the basement. Then the ceiling light flickered, once, twice. The room became dark. Lucas froze. Somewhere behind him, a child began breathing. Very slowly. Lucas didn't turn around. The temperature dropped. Then came the smell, burned wood, wet ash, and something else, like clothing left too close to a fire. The light flickered back on. Lucas looked toward the doorway. No one was there, but the basement corridor beyond it had changed. Children were standing along the walls. 5, then 7. Then more shapes became visible farther down the passage. None moved. Their clothing looked wrong. Different decades, different styles. Some wore uniforms Lucas recognized. Others wore clothes he had only seen in old photographs. And among them stood Mathieu. Lucas knew him immediately. The boy slowly lifted his hand. But he wasn't waving. He was pointing behind Lucas. Lucas turned. On the wall above the table, where there had been nothing moments earlier, hung another photograph. It showed students standing outside Saint-Antoine. At the bottom was a handwritten date, 1998. Lucas moved closer. He recognized Remy, Theo, several boys from his dormitory, and standing in the back row was Lucas himself. The photograph had already been taken, except Lucas had no memory of ever posing for it. Lucas stared at the photograph. There was no possibility that he was mistaken. The boy in the back row was him. Same hair, same jacket. Even the small tear near the collar was visible. But Lucas had never stood outside Saint-Antoine for a class photograph, and there was something else. Everyone in the picture was looking directly at the camera, except Theo. Theo was looking toward Lucas. Not the Lucas standing in the photograph, toward whoever had taken it. Lucas turned the picture over. Nothing was written on the back. Then, footsteps entered the basement corridor. Adult footsteps, slow, controlled. Lucas switched off the light and crouched behind the shelves. The children in the corridor were gone. A moment later, someone appeared in the doorway. Director Delmas. He entered without hesitation. He didn't search the room. He simply stood there. Then said, "You shouldn't be here, Lucas." Lucas felt his stomach tighten. Delmas couldn't possibly see him behind the shelves, yet he was looking directly toward his hiding place. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Delmas turned his attention toward the photographs. His expression changed. Not anger, concern. "You don't understand what you're looking at." Lucas remained silent. Delmas stepped closer. "This school existed long before you arrived." A pause. "And some things here existed long before the school." From somewhere in the corridor came a faint sound, a child whispering. Delmas immediately looked toward the door. For the first time, Lucas saw fear on the director's face. "Go back upstairs," Delmas said. His voice was different now, urgent. "Right now." Then the basement telephone rang. Once. Delmas went completely still. It rang again. He whispered something Lucas barely heard. "No." The third ring came, and every light in the basement went out. Lucas ran. He pushed past Delmas and entered the corridor. Behind him, the telephone continued ringing. Then came voices, children, dozens of them, whispering from the darkness. Lucas reached the stairs and didn't look back, but just before reaching the top, he heard Delmas scream his name. Not angrily, desperately. "Lucas, don't let them see you!" The following morning, Theo's bed was empty. At breakfast, Director Delmas announced that Theo's parents had arrived unexpectedly during the night and taken him home. Nobody reacted. Nobody asked questions. Lucas looked toward Remy. Remy kept his eyes on his plate. "That's a lie," Lucas whispered. Remy's hand stopped. Lucas leaned closer. "I saw his name downstairs." Remy finally looked at him. His face had gone pale. "You went into the room?" Lucas nodded. For several seconds, Remy seemed unable to speak. Then he whispered, "You need to leave." "I know." "No." Remy grabbed Lucas's wrist beneath the table. "You need to leave before they take the photograph." Lucas stared at him. "What photograph?" But Remy released him as a teacher approached. That afternoon, Lucas found something on his bed, a sealed envelope. Inside was a photograph, the same photograph from the basement, the 1998 class picture, except now, Theo was missing. There was an empty space where he had been standing. Lucas looked at himself in the back row. His image remained, but something had changed. The Lucas in the photograph was no longer looking at the camera. He was looking toward the upstairs windows of Saint-Antoine. Lucas followed his gaze. Behind one of those windows, a group of pale faces could barely be seen through the glass. He counted them. 7. One of them was Theo, another was Mathieu. That night, Lucas didn't sleep. Shortly after midnight, the footsteps began again. But they weren't above the dormitory anymore. They were inside it. Slow movements between the beds. No one opened their eyes. Lucas remained beneath his blanket, listening. Step, pause, step, pause. The temperature dropped. Then he smelled smoke. Something stopped beside his bed. Lucas could hear breathing, very close. A child's voice whispered, "Tomorrow." Then the footsteps moved away. Lucas never attended classes the following morning. Before breakfast, a staff member entered the dormitory and told him to pack. His parents had arrived. Lucas initially refused to believe it, but when he reached the entrance hall, his mother was standing there, his father beside her. Both looked confused and frightened. They had received a telephone call shortly before dawn. A man they couldn't identify had told them, "If you want your son back, come now." They had driven through the night. Director Delmas offered no explanation. He simply watched as Lucas left. As the car moved down the mountain road, Lucas turned for one final look at Saint-Antoine. Students stood behind several windows, motionless, watching. Then Lucas noticed one figure separated from the others. Remy. He stood at an upstairs window. Lucas raised his hand. Remy didn't respond. Instead, he slowly pointed upward, toward the highest floor. Lucas looked. Someone was standing behind a small attic window. A boy. Same face, same clothes, same tear in the collar. Lucas stopped breathing. He was looking at himself. A few weeks later, Saint-Antoine was officially closed. The reason given was structural instability. Lucas never returned, and according to his account, he never discovered who made the telephone call that brought his parents to the school. But years later, when he saw the old 1998 photograph again, his image was no longer in the back row. The space where he had been standing was empty. There is no complete public record that can verify everything Lucas claimed happened at Saint-Antoine. No confirmed list of every student who attended the school. No documented explanation for the children who allegedly disappeared, and no surviving evidence that can tell us what was really behind the locked areas beneath the building. According to the account, Saint-Antoine closed only weeks after Lucas left. The official reason was structural problems, nothing more. No public investigation into the disappearances was announced. No explanation was given for why the school had operated for years with so little accessible documentation. And later attempts to trace its history reportedly produced contradictory results. Some records appeared to acknowledge that Saint-Antoine had existed. Others contained almost nothing, as though pieces of its history had simply disappeared. There are, of course, rational ways to interpret parts of Lucas's account. Memories from childhood can change over time. Isolation can intensify fear. An old building can produce footsteps, voices, and sounds that seem impossible to locate. And stories shared between frightened students can become more disturbing with every retelling. But those explanations leave one detail unresolved. The children, Mathieu, Theo. The two boys who supposedly went home after entering the basement. Again and again, the same explanation was reportedly given. Their parents came for them. Yet according to the students, nobody ever saw them leave. And then there were the photographs. Children appearing in images supposedly taken decades apart. Names recorded beside unexplained dates. Faces that seemed to remain the same, while Saint-Antoine grew older around them. Lucas never claimed to understand what he saw beneath the school. He never knew why his own name appeared among those records. He never discovered who made the telephone call that brought his parents to Saint-Antoine before it was too late. And perhaps most disturbing of all, he never learned whether Director Delmas had been responsible for what happened there, or whether the director had been afraid of it too. Because on Lucas's final night in the basement, Delmas didn't tell him to remain silent. He didn't threaten him. He didn't try to stop him from escaping. He warned him, "Don't let them see you." Maybe Saint-Antoine was hiding something terrible. Maybe frightened children created explanations for events they couldn't understand. Or maybe the school wasn't keeping those children trapped inside. Maybe it was keeping something else from following them out. Saint-Antoine reportedly closed in 1998. The missing students were never clearly accounted for in the material surrounding this case. And if Lucas's account contains even a fragment of truth, one question remains. When his parents drove him away from Saint-Antoine that morning, did Lucas really leave the school? Or did something that looked exactly like him leave instead?